Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our KASB Live update for February 7th, a week of a massive parade in Kansas City for an important game that canceled the legislature, I guess, for the first time in 50 years. I don't know what happened in 1970 when this was good. We might not even have had a biennial legislature then, I'm not sure. But that was exciting, made the week a little bit strange. With me today, of course, is Leah Fleiter. We would want to acknowledge that doing his usual great job manning our controls is Rob Gilligan. Unfortunately, his last webinar with us, Rob is leaving us to take a very exciting job in Emporia, where he's from, where he's a city commissioner, and we call him the mayor still. So we're certainly going to miss his work and help, and we cannot vouch for what future KSB Lives will look like. But
if it looks like the Blair Witch Project, you'll know why.
You'll know why, but we will do our best with it. And of course, Scott Rothschild is also sitting in to help answer your questions or feed them to us, and Executive Director John Heim is here. It's apparently evaluation time here at KSB, so he's sitting in for that case. So let's plunge into kind of the news of the week at the State House. We want to start by talking about at-risk funding. As you know, this is kind of hanging over the session because the major issue in school funding that really has to be done if schools don't lose, some schools lose $50 million in state aid, is removing the sunset or reauthorizing or extending high-density at-risk weighting. A bill to do that had a hearing on, well, this week, I guess was Thursday. Senate Bill 271, so if you're contacting your legislators, particularly your senators, that had a hearing. There were no opponents to the idea. The committee has not worked it yet. It'll work its way to the Senate floor. I believe there is a recently introduced bill in the House. It has not been scheduled for a hearing. But tied to this issue in the House is Monday, the House K-12 Education Budget Committee has a hearing on House Bill 2540, which would set some new requirements on basically the expending and approval program of all at-risk funding, not just high density. This really grows out of the audit that was done, which has concerned a lot of legislators, raised a lot of concerns in the school community with the State Board and State Department of Education. We're going to testify in opposition to the bill. There are a couple things in the bill which we think really just sort of ratify current law and are not necessarily problematic, but the big issue is it would require, current law requires you to have your at-risk programs funded by weightings approved by the State Board of Education. But it can be approved, doesn't specify how or when, and the State Department approves these programs by reviewing your local consolidated plan with a lot of other things. This bill would require that all funding be spent only on programs that are on an approved list of best practices supported by evidence or programs supported by evidence approved by the State Board. Not really a big change, except it means you could only spend the money on something on a predefined list and not have the ability to look at maybe your own practices or your own evidence. So we're going to suggest that at a minimum, the process needs to be changed to give people who are looking at new and innovative approaches or a different set of research an option. And then the second thing that does raise some concerns is that it requires, and current law requires, reporting on how you use these funds, the student served, the program you use. There's a concern here that it adds a provision that you must document the program used, every program's results. And part of the concern is that many programs may be used and intertwined, and separating out whether this particular program or this practice was responsible, we think would also be problematic. So for those reasons, we're suggesting that those would work against. Beyond that, we'll really try to just focus our efforts on talking about where we have seen successes with at-risk, particularly if you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s, when we were constitutionally funded. All boats were rising for overall students as well as low-income students and other subgroups. That's changed, but only after basically 8 years of underfunding. There's also some evidence when you look at things like graduation rates, post-secondary attainment, we've continued to see improvement. So, complicated set of information. The picture is not as dark as some would paint, while at the same time, we all know if we're going to achieve our Kansas Can goals, we do have to continue to focus on kids who are kind of falling behind. Please.
I'm getting a message from one of our viewers that they have no volume.
Would any viewers who are getting volume let us know so we
That's
know
right.
where the problem is whether we're getting that? How did you get that?
I received an email.
I guess no issues at all.
I received an email.
Okay.
Not sure.
Not sure. Okay. Well, we'll continue. We're going to continue. We hope that's isolated, and if not, well, we'll just start over and record this again sometime. Leah, why don't you? There's one more bill we want to talk about, kind of under this umbrella. Has a hearing this week, Thursday. It's House Bill 2552. We're beginning to unpack this bill. There's certainly some things in it we know we oppose.
Right.
I believe you're going to testify.
Right.
On it.
This bill is called the Readiness bill. It was introduced, sponsored by Representative Renee Erickson, who sits on K-12 education budget. It's a bill. It's basically a voucher bill. We are hearing that some places do have sound, by the way. So.
Okay.
So it's basically a voucher bill. The bill says that if you are in third or fourth grade, and you are not reading on grade level, you may either take your base aid, your base aid funding, and take that money and go to a private school, or if you want to stay in your public school, the state treasurer would set up an account for you that represents the amount of money that you receive as a weighting, your at-risk weighting.
4.484 times base state aid.
Right. You would take the money that you would generate from that weighting. You would be able to, the parent would get an account set up for them by the state treasurer, and the parents could spend that funding on probably any kind of intervention that they think might help their child improve their reading score.
And as I remember the bill, it basically says that it's supposed to be evidence-based, research-supported.
That's correct.
But there's no provision for checking that.
That's
so
true.
So that would immediately raise an important question. If a parent is asking for a program, you know, does the school district get to evaluate whether
Right.
it's effective or not?
Right, right. And so, claims of effectiveness aside, this is essentially a voucher bill, and we will be opposing it as we oppose all voucher bills.
So we would encourage you to look carefully at that bill and its
Yes.
ramifications. We'll see whether there is much traction hearing Thursday. Certainly those of you that have concerns would be welcome to add your voice to testimony in person, written, or whatever. So let's turn now away to a couple of other bills. One we just had a hearing on today. In fact, that's one reason we're doing this back at our usual time. The Senate Assessment and Taxation Committee had a hearing today on Senate Bill 294. This is one you may want to be aware of because we're not quite sure how it may unfold. This bill essentially requires all taxing units and subdivisions, including school districts, to every year. Well, basically, if you want to adopt a budget that brings in any more property tax from any source that increases your overall property tax collection, you would have to go through an expanded process of providing public notice. The county would have to send an individualized letter to every taxpayer explaining the impact of the proposed amount increase that would be involved. So there's no exception, for example, growth in valuation or growth in population or growth in students collecting any more dollars. It was supported by Kansas Chamber of Commerce, it was supported by Kansas Policy Institute, Americans for Prosperity. Generally, groups that are concerned about taxation were supporters, and then a long list of local government, public service types, including KASB, testified against it. Our major focus would be to explain that all the additional costs of this notice would have to be borne by the local entity, the school district. All, of course, non-instructional costs that would have to be spent for a system where almost everything in the school budget is already limited, capped, subject to protest petition or election. So a good example might be if your voters have approved a bond issue.
Right.
And for whatever fluctuation there might be, you needed to have more property tax in a given year to meet your bond obligations. You would have to go through this process, and you could do it. There's nothing that says if you go through this process, you can do it. You just have to spend the money to go through this process before your board would have to vote, yes, we want to access this increase vote 1, then yes, we want to adopt this budget that spends it. So the chair, Senator Karen Tyson, who is the chair of the tax committee and the sponsor of the bill, has indicated she expects to work the bill, but expects pretty major changes, so we will keep you posted on what's going on there. Couple other things I'll mention, then Leah's going to monitor some things. We have talked to you before about House Bill 2461. This bill would put restrictions on the ability of local entities to enter into legal contracts on a contingency basis. In other words, if you have a contract that says you'll provide this legal service and it would be based on anything, you couldn't do that. It was really aimed at, it was pretty clear, because it's proposed by Attorney General Derek Schmidt, his concern that local unit lawsuits around things like vaping or opioids or whatever, the multiplicity of these local lawsuits hinders the state's ability to fashion a comprehensive response in the public interest. The other side of that, of course, is if it puts all the power in the hands of the Attorney General, who, if he doesn't want to pursue these things, effectively can stop it. Now, KASB has been asked to participate in high-level discussions about possible amendments and changes to this bill. One of our fine attorneys, Angie Stahlbaumer, has been participating in that along with representatives of other organizations. So I think there's a belief that we are working toward some improvements. Whether it would be enough to support or become neutral remains to be seen, but there's at least apparently willingness on the part of the Attorney General to deal with some of the problems. One of the things that is being talked about is moving from a he can veto anything to a you have to give notice of what you're doing, and then if he decides it's in the interest of the state, he could intervene, which I think the Attorney General already has the authority to do. So we will keep you posted as that moves forward. And then another bill coming up for a hearing this week on Monday is Senate Bill 335, Senate Education Committee at 1:30. This is a bill that would authorize school districts to use your general fund money to pay for the tuition and fees of students in dual enrollment programs for college credit. We will be testifying in favor of this. Our caveat, our delegate assembly did adopt a position in favor of this concept, but said it should be for at-risk kids, free lunch kids.
As defined by the State Department.
This bill is broader than that. It would apply to all. We'll see how the committee goes. But the concept is simply, we hear over and over from school leaders, we are trying to work with local colleges to give kids a start through these programs. One of the problems is that many of our low-income students can't afford it, and particularly because they're not eligible for Pell Grants or any other kind of student aid. Leah, do you have any thoughts on House Bill 2507, which is work insurance for work-based learning environments? I know
we've been working with the sponsor on this, Representative Sean Tarwater. You know, the idea is to try to make it easier for businesses and school districts to work together to offer kids some either job shadowing or internship kinds of things that in the past businesses have been a little bit reluctant because they're concerned that they might be held liable if somebody is injured on a shop floor or something like that. And so we've been working with the sponsor, and we will be monitoring that bill on Monday.
This is another one we've been asked to provide input. We're doing so, and we're optimistic, but of course, till it finally happens, you don't know, but we're certainly very much in favor of the concept. The original bill, we had some concerns about whether it would really do what the sponsor intended and what the committee wants to do, but it is scheduled for consideration on Monday. We would urge you to continue to watch that.
That's right.
I'm going to mention briefly and then shift back to Leah for some more bills. Capers-related action. I'm not even going to give you the bills. I'll just tell you that there was a hearing this week in the House, Financial Institutions and Pensions Committee, on the governor's plan to re-amortize capers. You may remember last year, faithful viewers of this program, that the governor had proposed a re-amortization program that would extend it out quite a while. This year, Governor Kelly is back with a plan that would basically just add 10 years. And very simply, the best way people can explain this is kind of like your mortgage. If you decide to take out a new mortgage over a longer term, you pay less every month, but it takes you longer to pay it off and you pay more interest. Her argument is you know, we need to kind of pull down these very high costs of capers,
right.
which have really grown to take care of this unfunded liability, give more budget flexibility. The Capers leadership, Alan Conroy, executive director, and their board, has basically said, we know we're going to amortize at some point. That is kind of a best practice, but we shouldn't do it yet because we still like owe too much. So we need to continue to be aggressive for a few more years. Will likely happen, but probably not now. The second part of the governor's proposal was to pay early about $270 million in missed payments over the last several years to the school group, basically, that weren't paid and then were supposed to be paid over 25 years. What she's basically saying is, our tax revenue has been coming in pretty good. Let's pay that whole thing off now, and then we won't have that roughly $20 million a year or something like that. That's another piece of that ongoing part that would also have more interest. This bill appears to have a lot more bipartisan support. There are two different bills, one in the House, one in the Senate, to just do this piece of the proposal. It appears a lot more likely. We'll keep you posted. In all cases, none of these would have any impact on benefits or anything else. It's really just a schedule of payment of finally trying to get kind of the long-term liability paid down, or at least to a more reasonable level. Okay, so do you, Leah, want to talk about a couple bills that are coming up this week?
We have some discussions coming up around student health and safety. We've got House Bill 2563 on Thursday. It's a kind of a combo bill. It is a tobacco 21 bill, so it says no cigarettes and things like that until you're 21. And it also
can't purchase.
Can't
it would
purchase.
Prohibit tobacco purchase or electronic cigarette purchase.
That's right.
Till 21.
Till 21. And then it also bans flavored vaping products. So we don't have a position on tobacco 21, but we do support efforts to ameliorate the vaping crisis, and so we will be testifying in favor of that. We also have 2450, which is vaping in relation to the Indoor Clean Air Act.
It would specifically, it would make, currently you are, by state law, are not to have tobacco products or smoking in schools. This would clarify that includes electronic cigarettes. That hearing had been held and we testified on that a week or two ago.
2450, yeah.
Things are running together.
Yes, they are, and I've been out of town and it was written down here on our list, and so.
So there we go.
So there we go. Coming up in the House Education Committee Tuesday and Wednesday, we have House Bill 2573 on Tuesday. We will be testifying against this bill. It would require that every student in Kansas, public, private, parochial school, be given and pass a civics education test before they can receive their high school diploma. This test would be roughly 100 questions, and it would be modeled on, I guess, the test that you have to take if you're becoming an American citizen. And so, you know, we would point out everybody already has a mandatory government class that they have to take in high school. I think many of us think that many adults would have a hard time passing a civics test. Now, maybe that goes to whether we need the test or not. But we will be opposing this bill on the grounds that it's unnecessary. And then House Bill 2519 is called the Right to Know Act, and this basically requires KSDE to post information about different career paths and majors, educational paths, and and how that might impact your job decisions and this future salary that you might hope to achieve. That, of course, is very similar to what the State Board of Regents already has on their website, and so KSDE will need to just kind of coordinate and link back to the State Board of Regents information on post-secondary. So it's a kind of an odd, right to know about what,
right.
But it's the right to know about what your education and career path might be.
And again, as I was there for the discussion of the bill, I think the concept is most of this information is already available, but maybe it's with the Board of Regents, or maybe it's with the Department of Labor, or whatever. But it's but it's not in the Department of Education on their website, and so the idea is to say, well, here's another place you should get it to make it easier. In a large extent, it may be a question of, well, what is the what is the impact on the Department of Education
Yes.
and their staff with all the
That's
things
right.
that they're being asked to do. Well, Leah, as you indicated, you've been gone most of this
Yes.
week, vacationing.
No,
Not in
not
sunny
vacationing.
Washington,
Yes,
D.C.
no, it was kind of cloudy.
Kind of
but
like here.
Not too cold, Washington,
So,
D.C.
what can you bring us back from our nation's capital that our
I
school leaders
was
should
in
know?
Washington, D.C. with several of our members at the NSBA Advocacy Institute. It's their annual kind of, people call it, a fly-in. You might be familiar with that term, where you
Fly
kind of
over to fly in.
over to fly in. You visit the nation's capital, learn about, get schooled up on your important issues, and then go visit your members of Congress. And so we had several folks from around the state who attended that conference, and we talked about the big push for NSBA this year is IDEA full funding. And we made some visits about that. The hope is that we can get a law passed that would phase in funding of IDEA over about 10 years. The shortfall is pretty significant. As we know, Congress enacted IDEA in 1975, promised to fund 40% of the excess cost of educating special students, and that has never been achieved. The current rate is around 14 or 15%. I believe it's expected to drop to about 13 as we have increasing populations, and so that's been a big push because, as you all know, what you get in special ed reimbursement affects also your state reimbursement and what you have to use from your general fund to make up any shortfalls. We had some good discussions. I think people are generally supportive of the concept. Senator Moran's office, he was very frank. He said, I certainly support the idea of this, but I serve on the Appropriations Committee, and there are not budget allocation levels for this kind of thing, and so I certainly would love to support that, but I can't really support something that I can't give you. So they've asked us to be in contact with Senator Blunt's office from Missouri, and if any of you know any Missouri school board members, you might ask them to contact Senator Blunt, and we'll also be contacting some of the House appropriators to see if we can at least express some concern and some interest in the budget caps being raised on that. This gets very into the weeds about federal budgeting and sequester and all that kind of thing.
Nothing better to talk about.
Nothing on a lovely Friday afternoon.
You do, and thank you, because that jolted me back to an item that I had skipped over, that on the subject of special education funding and budgets, and where there's no money, at least the argument is here in Kansas, in the legislature, the budget hearing for the Department of Education budget in Kansas will be held Thursday, I believe at noon.
I thought it was Friday.
What I saw on the calendar today is a hearing on Friday and hearing Thursday, action Friday. And this is the opportunity for people to make comments on the budget introduced by the governor. As you probably have been following, the school finance bill, based on the most recent estimates, will cost less. The formula will cost less than had been appropriated last year in the legislature, because enrollment and weighted enrollment is a little bit low. That savings is about $40 million a year. The State Department of Education had recommended that if there was such a saving, that additional amount go to special education state aid to push that excess cost, the share of excess cost covered, up more closer to the 92%. Would not get us there by a long shot, but would represent movement. Governor Kelly did not do that. So certainly many education leaders, and KASB's position is to support the 92%. That's the opportunity to do so. It is certainly possible they could make that decision. However, just as we hear at the federal level, one of the issues is the governor's put together a budget that does not include that. So if you are going to put that money in, the question is, well, where do we take that from? Is it from ending balances? Is it from another program? Is it from not cutting taxes, or whatever it might be? So nonetheless, state law talks about 92%. That's the goal that we have. So this is really asking us to just move toward what the legislature has said the policy should be, and minimize those transfers that we have to make now into special education. One other bill we would mention that is having a hearing this week, again a little complicated, is House Bill 2526, which I believe is Wednesday in the K-12 Budget Committee. This would address a problem that has emerged in our capital improvement aid formula. And to make it enormously complicated, I'm going to try, I'll make this as simple as I can. Several years ago, the legislature passed the formula which makes the starting point of the state aid you receive for bond aid the lowest assessed valuation per pupil district, which is Fort Leavenworth, and then you count up by thousands,
Right.
and wherever you are, whatever your district gets to, that's the percent you get. So at the bottom, you're at 25%. You go up by thousands. About the next lowest people tend to be maybe in the 20s, and so if you subtract that, it means that we tend to start around 50% or less. The problem is Fort Leavenworth's valuation never increases. Generally, everyone else's does. And that means that every year, people, it's sort of kind of a bracket creep, if you think of it that way, which means over time, inevitably, the equalization power will be weakened. So this bill would make the second lowest assessed valuation for pupil district the starting point, which presumably would at least avoid that bracket creep.
Right.
Now, it would only be for, don't get too excited, because this would only be for new bonds going
Right.
forward. It would certainly have an impact on the cost of new bonds because it would be a more generous formula, but it will also be phased in over time. So again, we will, I assume, you talked about, we would testify in favor of this. Equalization, we have a system now which, whether or not it was intended, gets less equalized every year. So at some point, this is going to have to be dealt with, so this is an important provision.
Speaking of bills
Sure.
or issues that we forgot to talk about, on Thursday we'll also hear a discussion in the House Ed about the state's vaccination requirements for K-12 schools. We're not sure if this is going to be a discussion of, maybe an exclusion date where kids, can't come to school unless they've had certain vaccinations, or if this is about, how the State Department of Health and Environment decides what vaccines kids have to have for school readiness. So we'll be monitoring that issue.
Absolutely. This would be another thing school nurses, others may also
Right.
want to be following and see whether it does turn into specific legislation. Well, before we wrap up, I want to maybe just, we've given you some top issues to think about. We'll come back to where we started. One of the big issues that we're looking at is at-risk funding.
That's right.
And the simple way to put it is at-risk funding is under scrutiny. So here are some things you can be doing right now. You can be reviewing and kind of collecting your information. What programs do you use? How do you use your at-risk funding? How have you selected those programs? What do you look at? What are you actually doing in terms of programs or personnel? What results are you seeing? What do you use to justify it? And be prepared to share that with your legislatures, because
Right.
the whole issue that we're looking at now, in a sense, comes down to, can school districts be trusted? Can the state board be trusted to identify programs and allocate it in a way that will help close that achievement gap? We haven't made much progress. Our argument has been that's really been due to the fact we've been dropping in funding, both in overall funding and the value of at-risk funding. But as we're phasing in the 6-year plan to respond to Gannon, as those dollars become more available, we have to be showing how we're using it, talking about the results we're at least expecting, and then what we see going forward. So I think a great exercise for school leaders would be put some time into putting together a response. Think of it as testimony. Think of it as a letter to your legislator, and frankly, a letter to your community, because there are a lot of conversations out there, and it really goes to the question of what is our stewardship of this additional
That's
state
right.
funding to help students get better. So this is your chance to talk about what you're
You
doing.
may even see those legislators this weekend, and if you don't have that information together, but they probably could say, hey, I've been hearing about this, what's going on? Just say, we are aware, and I'm getting that information together, and I'll be sure to share it with you.
Great opportunity to think of. We might just mention that next week we start hitting the bill introduction deadlines. Always a happy time for many of us. The last date for hearings on non-exempt bills in the first house is the last Monday in February, and then the last Thursday in February. So we really are literally about just a couple, starting to get a couple weeks away. It's what we call turnaround. That's when bills are supposed to be through their first house. So the legislature always seems to move very slow and then starts seeming to move fast. So we'll be keeping you a flurry of bills will probably be introduced this week, and then the great winnowing process of what actually moves forward will start happening. So as far as we know, barring any surprises, we will see you, at least Lee and I will see you next week, Friday, and we'll set the time again based on other things that might be happening at the Capitol. Anything I'm forgetting?
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you for viewing. Rob, thanks for all of your help today and before, the great work you've been doing. And obviously, if you have any questions for us, please let us know.